Hello and welcome everybody. We are broadcasting live from Sao Paulo, Brazil at the 2014 MIT Sloan Latin America China Conference. Thank you for joining us. My name is Samantha Pearson. I'm a correspondent for the Financial Times in Brazil. And then today I'm delighted to be joined by Yasheng Huang, International Program Professor in Chinese Economy and Business at MIT. He's also founder of China-India Lab, which provides low-cost consultancy services. I'm joined as well by Roberto Rigobon, Society of Sloan's Fellow Professor of Management and Economics at MIT. Roberto is a founding member of the Billion Prices Project. Welcome, professors. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Perhaps you could just start off by telling us a little bit about what we can expect from today's conference.
Yes, thank you, Samantha, for hosting this interview. We are organizing this conference to promote understanding and knowledge of each other on the part of Latin America and China. The trade and investment ties are increasing, are at a very high level, but the intellectual understanding of each other is relatively low compared with the economic ties. And we think as MIT, as a third-party institution, can come in and organize a neutral conference for people to exchange ideas and to gain understanding of each other.
Yeah, in addition to that, you can think that one of the most important steps in creating that relationship between these two regions is to build trust. And so not only understanding and communications, but to build trust, to move further from just trade relationships and investment relationships and lending, which is more or less what we have today, to move to more cooperation between these two regions. When you put them together, they're about 3/4 of the size of the United States. So it is a massive GDP, and there are massive opportunities if we can understand each other much better.
Thank you. Well, it sounds like it's going to be a great discussion. So over the next half an hour, we'll be discussing these issues and more. We also want to encourage those of you watching online, as well as those of you here in person who are just coming into the theatre now, to ask Yasheng and Roberto questions about both the Chinese and Latin American economies by using the hashtag MIT Live. Our team will be monitoring your questions throughout the next half an hour, selecting a few to answer. Following the question and answer part of our broadcast, we'll begin broadcasting the full conference in its entirety. For a complete list of today's panels and programming, please click on the agenda tab to the left of the player. So perhaps we could just start with a question, a very general question. What do you think are the challenges facing Latin American and Chinese economies in the near future? Perhaps Yasheng, you could start.
Sure. I think we talked about the increasing ties between these two regions. With the increasing ties, there's increasing economic interdependence between the two regions. So the economic growth of one region is going to affect the economic growth of the other region at a level and at a pace unprecedented, historically speaking. So in both regions, they have done very, very well in the past 10 years and 15 years. Their trade is increasing. But in both regions, we are facing some uncertainty about future economic growth and future economic development. There's clear sign, Roberto can talk about Latin America, but in China, there's clear sign that the economy is cooling down, is slowing down. The debate there is whether or not it is a long-term slowdown, secular slowdown, or a temporary slowdown, and whether or not the slowdown is going to take the form of gradual de-escalation of the growth rate, or is it going to come sharply down to earth? So these are the kind of the debates we hope to have at this conference.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in addition, I see all other macro shocks that are looming. I think the end of the commodity supercycle is very near, and that will clearly affect Latin America and China. And also, I think the normalization of interest rates in the world is going to take place very soon. It's going to be a very disorganized process. I mean, England probably will increase interest rates first, then it will be the US, but then Europe and Japan will be much later. So this normalization of interest rates will have an impact in the region. So I think those two are very important macro shocks ahead.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned the slowdown in the commodities markets. Which countries in Latin America do you think are more vulnerable to kind of the end of the super cycle, as we call it?
So I mean, Latin America is a very heterogeneous region, so it's hard to actually pin them down. But the way actually I look at them is, if you touch the Pacific, you are in good shape. If you touch the Atlantic, you are kind of doomed, roughly speaking. So you have countries like Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Chile, that even though their economies might not be totally booming, they are very well prepared to manage these shocks. They have diversified economies. They have a relatively healthy current account deficit, relatively small fiscal deficit. So they are prepared to manage macroeconomic events. Also, they have very conservative policies, which in some sense allows them to have room for expansionary fiscal policy in case of a negative shock. I think countries like Venezuela, Brazil, and Argentina are on the other side. They are not as well prepared as the others. So I think that those shocks are going to have a very heterogeneous impact in Latin America.
Mm-hmm. Well, perhaps this is a question for you, Yasheng. How important is Latin America really in China? Here in Brazil, it just seems that Brazil sells China commodities and China sends back mobile phone parts and television components. Is that correct? I mean, is Latin America a really important economy?
Well, Latin America is an important supplier of raw material, iron ore from Brazil, copper, salmon from Chile. You know, it's a very, very important part of trade in China. But in terms of market, it's not as important as it is as a source of raw materials and commodities. I believe that this is a problem. It's a structural problem that exists between China and Latin America. First of all, it has a tone of colonialism, that kind of thing. You know, it's politically, it's not a sustainable relationship. Also, economically, I don't think it's sustainable as well, because it is built on this massive housing boom in China, which is coming to an end. In the past 15 years, the housing boom has occurred on a massive scale in China. Every piece of evidence suggests it is slowing down. There's huge overcapacity in China across different industries: steel, cement, aluminum, you name it, right? So it's hard to imagine that China is going to continue to import this level and volume of commodities from Latin America. I think one question for Roberto and for many people in the audience to think about is which Latin American countries in the past have used the revenue from the commodities boom wisely and productively. Those countries are going to fare better than those other countries that have squandered and wasted those resources.
Yeah, the Pacific and the Atlantic.
Okay.
Is that how you see it then?
Yeah. And the way I say about the trade between Latin America and China is that we sell iron and they send us iPhones. That's the trade.
Well, but on
not
this,
very sustainable, by the way.
Roberto, on this iPhone thing, right? Chinese gets about 8%, 8 cents out of $100 worth of iPhone. It's the Apple, it's the Japanese companies, it's the marketing agencies in the United States. They get the bulk of the value added, right? Chinese actually get a very small proportion of the value added, right? Mm-hmm. Even though the goods come from China, but the value added capture is actually very low.
Yeah.
I'm trying to oversimplify things as an economist, so do not interrupt me.
Great. Well, just a quick reminder to those of you watching online who may have just joined us. We are broadcasting live from Sao Paulo, Brazil at the 2014 MIT Sloan Latin America China Conference. I'm joined by Roberto Rigobon and Yasheng Huang, both from MIT Sloan School of Management, and we'll be taking your questions until about 8:45 local time using the hashtag MIT Live, please, so you can have your questions answered live. Just talking about perhaps companies in Latin America and Brazil then, are they really making the most of the Chinese market, do you think? It seems that Brazilian companies, for example, they seem very reluctant to explore the Chinese market.
So I think that that's an interesting point. I think that Latin American countries are very willing to go to China and try to set up production facilities. I think that Latin America is very scared, in some sense, to receive Chinese influence here. So, for example, an example in Brazil would be that the involvement of China in the oil industry is something that scares the Brazilians. And so in some sense, I think that, again, going back to the lack of trust, I think that we go to China, Latin American companies, mostly to produce and try to take a piece of an incredibly big market, but we don't go enough in such a way that we can expand that relationship. So I hope that actually the discussions that we have today in this conference go a long way to understand how we can increase that relationship. Mm-hmm. There are examples, and there are banks that have relationships, but it's not strong enough, at least in my opinion. I don't know if you agree.
But I don't know if you agree. I mean, Mexico has done, as a country, I don't know about Mexican companies. Mexico as a country, right, in the 1990s, they were scared to death of China.
Yes, yes.
And I remember going there, they were all say that this is the end of Mexico and all of that. Now there are factories that have been relocated from China back to Mexico, and manufacturing employment is growing there. So something that Mexico has done has turned out to be right things that they have done. I don't know what, but it's important also to keep in mind there are some successful stories in Latin America.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, we will have Alejandro Werner here, the head of the Western Hemisphere and also Mexican. He was both in the Ministry of Finance and the Central Bank, exactly when the transformation took place. So hopefully we can have Alejandro answering those questions directly.
Yeah.
So yes. So.
Well, we've been talking about Latin America and China as partners one way or another, but often, for example, in Africa, they're actually direct competitors, like fighting over natural resources. Yeah. How is that battle going to play out? Is it going to damage potentially the relationship between the regions, do you think?
Well, I think so far, because the volume of demand is so large, right? So China definitely is one of the factors, but there could be other factors as well. So the real estate boom, if you look at the cycle of real estate boom in China, it has coincided perfectly in timing with the rise of GDP growth rates in Africa, as well as in Latin America. So around 2002, 2003, if you look at the pre-2002 period, post-2002 period, the growth rates look very, very different. If you look at China, the real estate boom really began to happen around that time. So far, it's not a matter of competition. Nigeria supplies, Sudan supplies oil to China, Latin America iron ores and copper. So I think worldwide, this end of super commodity boom is going to affect everybody, Africa and Latin America, not just one region.
Regarding your point about competition, there was a survey by Yasheng, a local company here, that asked Brazilian top CEOs. So it mostly about Brazil, but this could be applied to Latin America. And they had a very interesting question when they asked, what words do you think or come to your mind when they say Asia? And it's very interesting because the three most important words were competitor, threat, and future. So it is, and this is not a small. I mean, it was about 2/3 of people were saying future, about 60% were saying a competitor, and about 1/3 were saying threat. These were the three most important words used by all the executives in Brazil thinking about Asia. So this was not a specific question about China, but give you an idea that they not only feel that they are competitors in Africa, I think that they feel that they're competitors all the time. So, and I think competition is good. I also think that we can build trust and partnerships. So in that sense, hopefully we can add one word to that. It's future partnership.
But I think there's one characteristic of competition that can be problematic, right? So this is natural resource. The state ownership, the government ownership looms large in this sector. So essentially, the competition becomes competition among states, among governments, in terms of granting concessions, in terms of providing political cover and things like that. So it is quite different from competition between iPod and iPhone and Samsung, right? So I think, and also some of the countries that have a lot of natural resources are the nastiest countries in the world in terms of human rights and democracy and transparency. So environment, yeah, absolutely. So I kind of worry about that kind of competition.
We were talking about the Brazilian oil industry, for example. There's a lot of suspicion over the involvement of a Chinese state in the Brazilian oil industry. Is there anything that Chinese companies or the Chinese government in this case can do to ease their entry into that market?
Well, I think yes. I think it would be serving the Chinese companies' interests better if they can be more transparent, right? About ownership, about accounting information and all of that. The simple fact is that China is a huge economic entity. The knowledge of outside world of what's going on is relatively low. And that's not because of lack of intellectual investments in trying to understand the country. It's just that, for me, I'm Chinese. Even for me, it's really difficult because the data, I don't really understand the data. I don't understand the definition of the variable. So if they can do more in terms of transparency, in terms of coming up with straightforward standards, it will help a lot, right? And then you form an alliance with a Chinese company, at least you know who owns the company, right? Who is the government agency responsible for the company? I think that will help a lot, right? Especially at the time of economic slowdown, when there are so many people here who feel the threat from Asia. Right?
Well, just a quick reminder again to those of you watching both at home and in person, we're taking your questions for Roberto Rigobon and Yasheng Huang live. If you have a question related to Latin America and Chinese economies, as well as their broader impact on each other in the world, please use the hashtag #MITLive. Now, we've already been getting in some questions from our viewers at home. We've got one here from Boston. How might further economic instability in Argentina weigh on the Latin America-China relationship? Difficult question.
Yes, yes. I think that Latin America, not only in Argentina, but I think in Latin America in general, we're going to go through political transitions, and Brazil will have an election very soon, and I think that we're going to have a turnaround on policy in Brazil. If this political instability leads to a more reasonable policy in Argentina, meaning that at the end of this political uncertainty, we end up being a more conservative government, a more pro firms and pro-industry in Argentina, I think it could be very useful. So I don't mind uncertainty just by the issue of uncertainty. The outcome is what matters. So after the uncertainty, what comes? If after uncertainty we come more extremist policies, then Argentina will be in a lackluster state for a long, long time, and it will be isolated. But if this uncertainty is resolved in a positive way, I think that it will actually improve the relationships. I think that everybody looks for a certain amount of certainty when you invest, a certain rule of law, that you understand that when I write a contract, you are going to respect the contract, that the government is not going to violate the contract or not intervene into a contract that I have just written. So that basic aspect of rule of law, of course, is affected by uncertainty, but sometimes it can be resolved after an uncertain event. So hopefully in Argentina, this goes in the right direction. But you have more countries other than Argentina that are going through political crisis. And my country, Venezuela, in fact, all my countries, my dad was Argentinian, I am from Venezuela. So if I have your nationality, I think you are doomed. By the way, my grandfather is Italian, so I don't know if that's a predictor.
And he teaches in America, so...
Yeah, and I teach in the United States, yeah. And I became a U.S. citizen in 202008, so maybe I was...
You should give it up to prevent the financial crisis.
Well, actually, maybe I caused it.
Well, I'm without knowing a lot about Latin America, I'm more optimistic. I think so far, I mean, Roberto can correct me, so far we have not seen the evidence that the financial crisis in Argentina has spread to other parts of Latin America. So contagion has not happened, right? If you look at what has happened in the past, in 1998, something happened in Russia, Brazil got affected in 1994, something happened in Mexico, the rest of Latin America went down the tube. I think maybe it's because people are used to bad things happening in Argentina, so they think it's an Argentine-specific event, and the investors and the debtors are sophisticated enough to distinguish between Argentina and the rest of Latin America. In terms of trade investments, Argentina is not a big component of China trade investments in the region. It's really, Brazil and countries like that are important. So if Argentina's crisis is contained within Argentina, the effect will be limited.
That's true.
Yeah. So we've got another question here for you, Yasheng. Do you think that China can grow forever? And do you think that China can transition to an innovation-based economy?
Okay, so I think the two questions are actually related to each other. The first question is easy. No country has ever, grown fast forever, right? So actually, a lot of Latin American economists have studied this issue. It is really remarkable that countries that have grown fast in one decade are not the same countries that have grown fast in the next decade. The relationship between the first decade and second decade is really, really low, and it is really a very substantial finding on the part of economists who have studied economic growth and economic development. The sign is very clear in China that the slowdown is happening. And I don't think that we're going to see another decade of 8 or 9% a year, right? And I just don't see it.
No way.
Yeah, I just don't see it. And the issue here is whether they can maintain 7, 6.5, 6%. If they can maintain that, that would be super, super good and miraculous, actually, in my own view. That would depend on a number of things. One is that reforms have to happen. The state sector has to be streamlined. They have to shift from this over-reliance on investments to consumption. They have to shift from this massive kind of investment-driven growth model to innovation-based growth model. China has a lot of scientists. China has some first-rate universities. But the evidence is that Chinese scientists are good at publishing papers. If you look at MIT, for example, if I can do a little bit of advertising for MIT, MIT scientists are not just publishing in Nature and Science. They are also busy creating entrepreneurship, creating companies. One study shows that combined sales of MIT affiliated, MIT alumni created companies is something like, equivalent to 11th largest GDP in the world.
$1.3 trillion.
1.3 trillion, I mean, one university, imagine that, right? The Chinese science and research has now done nearly in terms of creating economic value as R&D in the United States. So I think that requires political change. It requires some democracy. It requires rule of law. Requires protection of property rights. Requires greater respect for intellectual property rights. Right? And that has yet to happen.
Right, I think this one's for you, Roberto. What would happen to Latin America if a financial crisis struck in China? God forbid.
So I think that if that were to happen, I think countries are prepared in different dimensions. So there are countries that have very large current account deficits and very large fiscal deficit that rely on loans from China to continue subsist. Continue working, and therefore those countries will be heavily affected by a financial crisis in China. I think that the commodity producers will also be affected because a financial crisis in China will imply a tremendous drop on commodity prices. So therefore, how diversified you are. So for example, a country like Chile, I understand they produce a lot of commodity, but they have the ability to adapt relatively fast. They have a very good fiscal accounts, very good current account, so they will be prepared. A country like Venezuela, which have a massive fiscal deficit, we have massive amount of inflation, a tremendous reliance of lending from China, and on top of that, we are commodity producers, we will be even in worse shape. So, I mean, those will be the extremes. Mexico, for example, and Chile will be the best prepared to manage that. But a financial crisis in China will have two impacts. One will be on the commodity prices, but the other one is the lending. There's tremendous amount of lending that takes place from China, especially the Chinese Development Bank is one of the bigger lenders to Latin America, bigger than the World Bank and the IMF and the IDB put together, okay? So that will affect smaller countries like Central American countries that are reliant on that and those funds. So that would be kind of a credit crunch for them.
I think this one is probably for both of you. Is there an economic united front in developing countries? It's an interesting one. So, looking at the BRICS initiatives, are China and Brazil partners with Russia, India? Is that working as a concept, do you think?
So
does it work as a concept? The initiatives that we have at BRICS, does it, and the idea that we want to create like a bank,
exactly.
like a development bank for BRICS, does that make sense or not?
No, I think it's an artificial concept.
We agree for the first time ever. This is just.
Well, maybe we disagree on whether.
In fact, we disagree. Whatever he says, I'm going to disagree. Now I have to change my opinion now.
I think. Well, okay. So I think in one sense the concept makes sense. In another sense, it doesn't make sense. Right? In one sense, in the sense that it makes sense. In the sense it makes sense. It is in the following sense. These economies in the past 20 years, it was coined by Goldman Sachs. So let's bear in mind who is the father of the coinage. They have something to sell to you. But in one sense, I think the concept is accurate in the sense that these economies, if you look at their growth rates, right? China has always been growing fast. But if you look at India, if you look at Brazil, Brazil emerged from hyperinflation to, 2-3 percentage points, right?
Well, 6.5 now.
Yeah, so that's a respectable record considering the history, right? There's a term called lost decade. When Korea was growing, Japan was growing, Taiwan was growing, the rest of Latin America was mired in debt crisis. So sometimes we forgot the starting point of Latin America. It was a very bad starting point. Military dictatorship and all of that. They were able to solve these macroeconomic problems due to the fact that this region has a lot of first-rate macroeconomists. Interesting fact. And so that's good. That's a substantial achievement. India, it was low growth. It's called Hindu rate of the growth, right? The growth rate barely kept up with the population growth rate. In the 1990s, they began to grow 5-6%. So in that sense, it's correct. In the sense that it's not correct is the sense that Goldman Sachs meant when they originally coined the term, which is that they're going to become a big market, absorbing all this kind of a production. It turns out not to be the case, right? China, yes, buys a lot of stuff from Latin America, but it sells a lot of stuff to Europe and to the United States. China basically is a factory through which think about throughput process, right? Lots of stuff goes in, lots of stuff goes out. The domestic consumption of Chinese, 1.3 billion Chinese, is barely 35% of the GDP, right? So as a market development, the concept falls short.
Yeah. So the way I think about this is a little bit more as an economist, is what problem are these institutions trying to solve? So if you are going to create an institution, what is the problem that they are trying to solve? And are these the right members? Are these the right partnerships? So when I look at development bank finance on BRICS, I said, are these the natural partners to have the development bank? So size is not all that matters. It's not the only dimension that matters. So what I don't like about the concept is exactly that it feels like it's just fixed and it's just imposed, as opposed to start answering the question from what is the problem that you're trying to solve. If you, for example, I completely agree that maybe you don't want to have or do reliance on the World Bank and the IMF. Maybe they are too driven by the agenda of developed nations, and therefore you would like to create some development bank that provides help and financing of projects from emerging markets. So if you formulate the problem that way, then my next questions will be, well, what should be the natural partners? And the natural partners are not only 4 countries. I would put like 80, no? I mean, I don't know if they are counting correctly, but why 4? And why call it BRIC? These are the bigger countries in these regions, but it's not clear whatsoever why they have to be the leaders in the creation of these institutions. So that's the part that I don't like. It feels like it's an arranged marriage, and sometimes they work, but not always.
Well, on that point, unfortunately, that is all we've got time for today as the conference is about to begin. Thank you very much, Yasheng, Huang and Roberto Rigobon, for joining us and sharing your insights on the Latin American and Chinese economies, as well as their relationship to each other and the rest of the world. Really thought-provoking conversations. So I'd also like to thank our online and in-person viewers for their great questions. We'll be back in a few short minutes, driving into the welcome remarks, as well as the conference first panel, Growth Prospects in Latin America, featuring Roberto Rigobon, among others. For a full agenda of today's segments, please click on the Agenda tab to the left of the player. I'm Samantha Pearson with the Financial Times, and stay tuned to enjoy the rest of today's conference, live from Sao Paulo, Brazil.